Hi everybody, I'm the Nejicon support from Side by Side Special 2000 that I forgot to mention in the last episode. And welcome to Volume 14 of Japan-only PS1 games, the connoisseur's choice for wheel-based PS1 videos, assuming there is actually such a thing. Fan selection rules are still in effect, which means we've got 4 juicy picks straight from the Japan-only viewer wheel. How juicy these are, well, you're just gonna have to wait and see, so sit back, relax, and let the wheel provide.
You will provide.
Kicking things off today, we have a game that I've been looking forward to talking about for quite some time now. It's the Firemen 2, Pete and Danny, a rather early release on the console, making its way to the PlayStation in December of the year 95. This game was chosen for us today by Max over on Patreon, and also Red Fox, who is now yet another 2-time winner. Another case of wheel favoritism and action, but hey, who are we to argue with its majesty, especially when it delivers us sprite-based firefighting games? Yes, that's right, it's the Firemen 2, the PlayStation exclusive follow-up to the original Firemen, a game that launched on the Super Famicom back in 1994 and actually managed to see a PAL release in the summer of 1995. And look, this right here is one of my all-time favorite Super Nintendo games, and probably also my favorite firefighting game too. I mean, it's not exactly a crowded genre, nor is this one realistic in the slightest, but in regards to turning the act of firefighting into a fun video game, this is still the GOAT as far as I'm concerned. Sorry Roscoe McQueen, Firefighter Extreme, there's just no way you can be an old man with a mustache that's skilled in multi-directional strafing. We'll talk a little more about the original Firemen in time, but today, our focus is on the Firemen 2, Pete and Danny, which for all intents and purposes is more of the same, but now on the PlayStation. Does that mean it's a better game though? Well, that's what we're hopefully going to find out today after we put out many fires and also fight some dinosaurs, I guess. So first things first, both the original Firemen and its sequel come from a developer called Human Entertainment, a pretty big name in Japan at the time, and one I'm sure a lot of you are quite familiar with, even if a lot of their games never made it over to the West. We're talking fan favorites like Mizurna Falls, Remote Control Dandy, and Twilight Syndrome to name but a few. And there's also the Fire Pro and Clock Tower games, they seem pretty important too. So as you can see, Human had a pretty varied repertoire when it came to their games. One minute you're giving somebody a Tiger Driver in Fire Pro, the next you're fighting a fire like a pro. And the fire also has bullet patterns that you gotta be wary of. That's video games, baby. Now the plot of this game follows our 2 heroes, Pete and his partner Danny, as they respond to a fire that's broken out at a high-tech amusement park. This means not only do we get to fight fires and occasionally ride a roller coaster, but it also means the park's attractions are malfunctioning due to said fire and making things significantly harder for our heroes. But on the bright side, it does make for an exciting video game, and also that dinosaur thing from earlier now makes a little bit more sense, so that's good. We'll talk a little more about the story in time, but for now, let's cover the gameplay basics, which is essentially shoot water at fire until fire go away. A very simple premise, but one that is also incredibly satisfying in action. You have access to 2 different types of hose shot, I guess you could say, a powerful linear shot, which you'll use for most types of fire, and a downward spray, which is almost entirely used for clearing the smaller patches of fire left on the floor. You can rotate your character freely while using your hose, although it's worth noting your character's rotations are a little slower than most games, which I imagine is a conscious design choice to simulate the weight of all this firefighter gear, and something I think works in favor of the game's overall balance. If a fire catches you by surprise, you can't just like Robotron blast it as if it's a twin-stick shooter. Nah, you gotta turn your old ass around and back the fuck up. Of course, to do this effectively, you've got to master proper usage of the most important tool in your arsenal, the strafe button. If you hold down the R1 button, your character locks their direction, and from here, you can now blast water in the direction of your choosing while being able to move about freely. Honestly, you'll probably want to play the entire game like this if you can, because not only is it very effective, but it's also incredibly satisfying to mow through a room full of fire and just moonwalk your way out of there. And really, for the most part, that's all you need to know to play the Fireman. There's a few extra tools like a button for AoE water bombs, you can hold the circle button to crawl, which lets you get under some objects, and finally, if you hold R2, you can run slightly faster, which, considering the game's levels have time limits, well, you'll probably want to get used to holding whenever possible. And yeah, that's about everything really. Now you may ask yourself, what about the other guy with the axe? Well, that's our partner Danny, and for the most part, he is entirely useless. You have no direct control over him, which is quite unfortunate because Danny can in fact take out fires using his axe, and he's pretty good at it too. It's just 99% of the time he doesn't seem to remember that and instead just wanders around aimlessly, which is definitely useful in stressful situations. Now Danny is also in the Super Nintendo original, where he is notably more willing to participate in firefighting activities, but unlike the Super Nintendo original, which is a single player only experience, the Firemen 2 introduces co-op gameplay into the mix and allows a second player to control Danny and finally make him useful 100% of the time. He more or less functions the same as Pete, only with an axe instead of a hose, which means he cuts down fire or just stamps it out, but hey, it's surprisingly effective. Now the game itself is broken up into 9 different stages that all have a nice linear flow to them. There's the odd extra room you can explore for items or to put out a few extra fires so you can try reach that coveted 100% clear rate, but for the most part it's just a case of pushing forward, clearing fires, occasionally fighting a few wacky robots, and then if you're lucky you might get to take on a boss fire, which are enhanced ultra wacky versions of real life fires. I mean, nobody wants to deal with an electrical fire, right? Well, in video game form, it's also quite the menace. Now, despite this very linear, almost arcade game-like flow, the action does pause from time to time for some in-game cutscenes where you might get an update from your team, or possibly just to raise the stakes dramatically, and all of these cutscenes are fully voiced too, and sound quite nice, although it is all in Japanese and the game has no subtitles, so most of you, including myself, will be out of luck during these scenes, and you also can't skip them either, which is probably fine on your first playthrough, but if you plan on playing through this thing again, I could see it being a bit bothersome. Although, good news, even though this game at the time of recording doesn't have an English translation patch, a YouTuber by the name of Johan has a full playthrough of the game on his channel with English subtitles, so if you do care about the story and want to keep up with it, there is an option out there. So big thanks to Johan for the effort, you'd love to see it. And I suppose since we're talking about the voice acting, this would be a nice segue into the audio and overall presentation, which, while certainly quite nice, has a hard time shaking the feeling that it's an enhanced 16-bit game, just now with some CD quality audio and voice work. You see, a big thing with the Firemen 2 is that it's very difficult not to compare it to the first entry in the series, and while I think the Firemen 2 looks a little cleaner and runs a bit smoother, it's not a great example of a next-gen leap when it comes to 2D visuals. In fact, without looking at them side by side, I'd imagine most people could mistake the Firemen 2 for a Super Nintendo game, a very good-looking Super Nintendo game, but still not a great showcase for the PS1 or its visual capabilities. Likewise, the audio here is nice, I guess. It's certainly a bit more cinematic thanks to the move over to the CD format, which I think suits the tone of the game quite well. It's just that it's kind of a little forgettable too, especially compared to the first game's soundtrack, which, in spite of being limited to the Super Nintendo sound chip, just sounds so much more lively and fun throughout the game. In fact, the thing with the Firemen 2 as a whole is that while it's quite a good video game in its own right, it basically lives in the shadow of the original Firemen, which I've got to say is hands down a more well-rounded and expertly crafted experience. Now, neither of these games are particularly long, right? Both should take you around an hour to get through, and honestly that's fine for me. I think there's a place for short games that are all killer no filler, which is what this series aims to be. But if you play through the Firemen 2, while it's certainly fun, once you reach the end it kind of feels a little bit, I don't know, anticlimactic. Like, your first thought will probably be, oh, is that it? Whereas if you played the first Firemen before finishing this game, your thought when you reach the end will most likely be, oh, they've clearly rushed this game, haven't they? The Firemen 2's biggest problem is that it's worse than the first game in almost every single way. Like, somehow, the first game, which takes place entirely in a chemical factory, is more outlandish and exciting than the game that takes place in an amusement park. The first game has more interesting level and visual variety, more gimmicks, more enemies, better bosses, the levels are less linear, requiring you to use a map to search out people to rescue, and it also has a backdraft feature which requires you to quickly duck to avoid damage, and it's just something that is completely absent from the sequel. There's also noticeable downgrades like the handy map, which is now replaced with a radar that just doesn't work all that well. Not to mention, there's rarely any point of exploring levels in this game because they're so linear, and when you do, they're practically devoid of items or rewards for doing so. Even the crawl function is needed maybe once in the entirety of the second game, whereas in the first game, it's a core part of the gameplay that you're going to be using all the time. In fact, the only thing that I'd say is an improvement over the first game is the inclusion of co-op, which to its credit is really fun and something I wish was present in the first game too. But if you're playing solo, the original Firemen just eclipses this follow-up in every single way, and that's really quite the shame because the gameplay at its core is still an absolute blast. It's simple, it's satisfying, and it's challenging when it needs to be. It really does feel like this amazing hybrid of twin-stick shooter and, I don't know, power hose simulator. Like, if you enjoy clearing areas of bad stuff with water, but also dodging fireballs and blowing up weird robots, well then this series is a match made in heaven for you. But unfortunately, it doesn't change the fact that the Firemen 2, while still really enjoyable in its own right, is also a huge disappointment for fans of the series, because at the end of the day, the one job a direct sequel has is to improve on the original, and unfortunately this game absolutely drops the ball in that regard. But hey, even with my issues, it's still probably the best firefighting game on the PlayStation, the language barrier is low, it's a lot of fun and co-op, and you can rescue some penguins too, which we love to see. So by all means, if this game looks appealing to you, 100% check it out. Just make sure to check out the original too so you can get the best Firemen experience possible. You know, minus the penguins and co-op of course. Seriously though, those penguins are pretty great.
かわいいもんだな。大変だ。お願いです。ペンギンたちを助けてやってください。
You will provide.
Thrilling and thrashing battle simulator. Metal Jacket.
Next up, we have the thrilling and trashing battle simulator, Metal Jacket, another very early release for the console, making its way to the PlayStation in September of the year 1995. This game was chosen for us today by Peter Plopper, which I believe might also be the government name of Spider Pig, you know, when he's not in spider form. So Metal Jacket is a bit of an interesting pick, as it's probably one of the more obscure games we've seen in this series so far, let alone one that's been submitted as a viewer pick. It's essentially a first-person mech battle simulator, a genre that seemed to be quite popular during the mid-90s especially, and during the early days of 3D gaming, it wouldn't be uncommon to find at least a few mech combat games in the library of your favorite now-dead system. In fact, if you remember all the way back to the first volume of this series, our very first game to be chosen by the wheel was a fun little mech combat game called Extreme Power, a pretty janky and basic mech combat game, but a fun one nonetheless. And today's game, Metal Jacket, is yet another janky and somewhat basic mech combat game that serves as a nice early snapshot of the genre, as well as 3D gaming as a whole. But of course, the important question, is it actually any fun? Well, let's find out. So Metal Jacket comes to us from publisher Pony Canyon and a development team known as Team Wind, and given the obscurity of both this title and its developers, it's hard to know if they worked on anything before or beyond this, but Pony Canyon themselves did publish quite a number of games in the mid-90s, most notably bringing the likes of Ultima and D&D to Japanese consoles and computers, which you love to see. Now, what we know of Metal Jacket is that it's a self-proclaimed trilling and trashing battle simulator, but what does that actually entail? Well, for the most part, it's mechs moving around a battle arena shooting at one another until somebody wins. Now, whether that battle is a 1v1, a free-for-all, or if it's team-based, that's really up to you. In fact, most of this game's options are very much up to you, as the game kind of opts for a free-form approach to its design, which is to say that it gives you a bunch of menus and toggles, and says go ahead, organize your battles, and then just play them out however you like. This means if you're hoping for a game with some linear or structured single player content like a campaign or story mode, this game for the most part doesn't have any. Now, I say for the most part because there is something in here that you could classify as a story mode, but yeah, you'll see in a moment. So I suppose a good place to start would be the main menu, where you're given the choice of 3 different modes: battle mode, mission mode, and 2-player link mode, which allows you to play either battle or mission mode with a friend, as long as the two of you have a whole ass link cable set up to hand. Battle mode is probably the most straightforward of the game types available, and also the best place to explain the setup of the game. You see, when you select a mode, you then have to set up the game to your liking. This means you've got to select from one of 6 different combat arenas, each of which featuring their own unique visuals and some level-specific gimmicks, as well as the time of day, of which there are quite a few options available. From here, we move on to the menu that all mech fans love to see, the customization screen, which includes quite a few options. There is, of course, the mech selection itself, of which you have 9 to choose from. Unfortunately, the customization of these mechs is quite limited, as the only thing you can change are its color palette and which of the 2 normal and special weapons you want to go for. The mechs on offer kind of give you some different archetypes to play around with. You can go for a speedy glass cannon or a chunkier, more defensive orientated mech, but in general your customization options are unfortunately quite limited, at least when it comes to choosing parts and designing your mech, because there is actually a lot you can play around with here. Things like turn speed, overall mobility, the armor values of your mech. It can be a little overwhelming and confusing at first, which the language barrier certainly doesn't help with, but the main thing to understand here is that the game lets you customize essentially whatever you want. If you want to make your mech slow, fast, OP, whatever, you have the freedom to do that. The game does not care. Once you're happy with your mech and you're ready to rumble, you then gotta pick your opponents or teammates. Battles can feature up to 8 mechs in action simultaneously, and whether that means you want to do a 2v2, a 4v4, or an 8 mech free-for-all, well, that's once again up to you. And with that out of the way, we can now play our big mech battle, and yeah, that's pretty much the entire setup of the game. Pick a bunch of options, play around with them in whatever way you want, and then engage in a big mech battle. If you're hoping for any sort of progression system or the ability to unlock anything, this is not the game for you. It's pretty much entirely a simple mech battle simulator, which I can't imagine many people would be into nowadays, but it's something I definitely could have seen a market for back in '95, when the novelty of a competent 3D mech simulator would have been the selling point alone. Of course, that's assuming the mech simulation and combat in this game is competent in the first place, and the answer to that is that it kind of is. Metal Jacket, while clearly a very early and simple 3D game, has a lot to like. It's just, unfortunately, it also has some rather important parts which I don't like, but let's talk about the good for now. Now, the actual act of moving your mech around the arenas feels pretty good. There is only one field of view available, and it doesn't exactly use the most orthodox of control setups, but after a few battles and some expert level claw grip on my controller, I found the movement was pretty decent and had a good amount of heft and weight to it when all was said and done. You have access to a jump and boost, which are limited but do recharge automatically when not in use. Those 3 yellow bars in the bottom representing your fuel for each, as well as your health at the top. The remainder of the UI is taken up by your ammo, timer, target reticule, map, and radar, which all work as you'd expect. The map in particular is quite handy as it allows you to track your allies or opponents on the grid, so you'll never find yourself lost while looking for a fight. Although when it comes to the fighting, combat is where things get a little bit trickier though. Even though the game lets you select between 2 different weapons when loading out, all mechs come loaded with 4 different attacks. Your basic infinite machine gun, a more powerful limited machine gun, a special weapon such as grenades, shotguns, or lasers, and finally some rear bombs, which are used for attacking enemies trailing behind you. Certainly quite situational, but also quite useful. Now the thing with combat in this game is that while there is a simple auto aim, it doesn't really work all that well, nor is there any traditional target lock style weapons, which means you kind of have to be on point with your aim in this game, something that can be a little tricky to do thanks to your mech's rather hefty control and also how fast your opponents can be. Not to mention, your enemies do like attacking you from above, and you've got to manually aim up and down to hit them too, which is easier said than done. Now, if you factor this in with some rather limited ammo supplies during the battles with no way of replenishing them, well then, as you can see, tactical and careful usage of weaponry is a must in this game if you want to succeed, something I was not very good at, let me tell you. But long story short, once the battle is done and one mech is left standing, they're the winner, and then you reload and do it all over again on a different map. Why the hell not? And yeah, that's pretty much the entire battle mode experience. But what about that story content I told you about? Well, if you select the second option from the main menu, you can enter mission mode, which is more or less the exact same experience as battle mode, only the game is now split up into 2 teams, one tasked with protecting an objective and the other tasked with destroying it. You do get a little cutscene before these missions explaining the backstory and objectives within, but it is still the same loadout menu and customization options. The only major difference is that when you get into the levels, you've got the new objectives, of course, and the addition of some fodder units on the map. Certainly a nice change of pace, and by far the closest the game feels to having some semblance of structure, but at the end of the day, it's still clear the primary goal of this game is to give you a sort of mech playground where you customize your own missions and battles. It's incredibly limited nowadays with only 6 maps and 9 mechs in total, but in 1995 I could certainly see the appeal, especially if you were to set this up in 2-player link mode where you and a buddy could take on missions together, which I feel is the intended way for this game to be played. Although beyond that, unfortunately I think the real issue with this game is that despite some decent mech movement, the combat just feels really underwhelming and kind of unbalanced, honestly. Now keep in mind, I am aware that you can adjust the mech stats in this game, right? But even when I give myself the most overpowered mech and fight the most underpowered mechs, it can often take nearly all my ammunition to take out a single target. Now at first, I thought this was just me missing most of my attacks, but even with decent accuracy, enemies are just so tanky in this game, and that goes for the objectives in mission mode too. They just take so long to die that you have pretty much no ammo left over to defend yourself or take out other enemies. I mean, in an 8-player battle, if I take out one of my 7 opponents, I'm pretty much fucked against the next 6 because my ammo is just all gone. You combine that with some pretty weak weapon feedback and sound effects, and unfortunately, the combat just kind of drags down the more positive aspects of this game, which is a shame because there's definitely some nice aspects to it, in particular the game's presentation, which as a fan of old low-poly games, is something I really quite enjoy. The mech designs, while quite simple, certainly have a lot of charm, as do most low-poly robots, I suppose, but they do look good in action when moving around the arenas. As for the arenas themselves, they are also quite lovely to look at. Functionally, they're quite simple, being made up entirely of flat land with the odd few buildings or trees placed around for effect, but they have a pretty nice vibe going on, and the ability to change the weather and stage effects allows for some really nice visual variety with the sky and background. It's nothing special, but it did also feel kind of cozy, if I'm being honest. Also, I'm a really big fan of this damage effect they use, where if you're really low on health, the game starts turning off your screen square by square, slowly obscuring your vision until you eventually explode in a lovely low poly explosion. I mean, You love to see it. As for the music and sound, well, this too is also quite nice. Now, I did mention before that the weapon sound effects leave a little bit to be desired, but the mech sound effects and the command communication effects do a great job of giving you that mech simulation experience. It can be pretty noisy and rather hectic, but it certainly sounds like you're in a heated battle, and at the end of the day, that's pretty much all you want really. The music is also rather decent too. There's a nice selection you can choose from before each battle, and while they do often get drowned out by the sound effects of the fights themselves, I did find them pretty fun and a nice throwback to the sounds and vibes of early PS1 game soundtracks.
Don't kill me! Put me on, you loser. No way, Jose! This can't be happening! Dogman down? Joker's under fire! From the back! We're fighting now! Attack!
So all in all, Metal Jacket is a game that really does feel like a product of its time, and I suppose in the grand scheme of things, a pretty niche title even within its niche, but it's still nice seeing games that cater to this audience, even if the game that we got isn't exactly what I'd call a shining example of the genre. Truthfully, beyond its weird structure and lack of content, it's the awkward and lackluster combat that really lets it down, but it's still something I could see people enjoy for its low poly aesthetic, and hey, if you manage to get a link cable setup going, 2-player might actually be pretty fun, I think. You never know. In fact, funnily enough, this game was pretty close to making it out in the West through Electronic Arts of all people. It even went far enough to get some official box art before being cancelled. So there you go, there's a look at what could have been. Probably wouldn't have done very well in the West, so I'm not surprised it got cancelled, but still, the game sure does have some lovely polygonal trees and purple skies, and hey, nobody can ever take that away from it.
Wrapped up.
You will provide.
Kicking off the second half of this volume, we have Panzer Bandit, which made its way to the PlayStation in August of the year 1997. This game was quite the popular pick on the viewer wheel, having been selected by 3 fine folk, including Siegmeme, the Seven Wags, and our old pal Dylan. And yeah, if you've ever seen or played this game, you can probably see the appeal right away. Now, throughout this series, we've been lucky enough to come across a number of Japan-exclusive titles that effectively acted as PlayStation replacements for a popular Sega game. We of course had Rally Day Africa for Sega Rally, Project Gaia Ray for Virtual On, and my personal favourite, the amazing Gamera 2000, which was just Panzer Dragoon with a space turtle and dance music, and also some amazing live-action cutscenes. Seriously, everybody needs to play this damn game. Well, Panzer Bandit is yet another one of these Sega clones, I guess you could say, and probably one of the more well-known ones too, because it's quite clear Panzer Bandit shares a lot in common with the excellent Sega Saturn beat-em-up from Treasure, Guardian Heroes. And look, as I always say, there's nothing wrong with emulating a good game, as long as you also happen to make a good game in the process, which so far has thankfully turned out to be the case with these Sega-inspired PlayStation games. But what if I told you Panzer Bandit is more than just a mere clone, and in fact, in some ways Guardian Heroes owes quite a lot to this game too? Well, not this game, but Panzer Bandit's developer, Phil in Cafe, a name you might remember thanks to Volume 7's selection, Community Palm, which was easily one of the best games I've played in this series so far, and also has a fan translation now too, so you're gonna definitely want to check that out. Well, Phil in Cafe, before developing Panzer Bandit and Community Palm for that matter, made an X68000 game called Mad Stalker Full Metal 4th, a 1994 release, which was a cool single-player beat-em-up where you went to town on enemies using a big mech. It looked good, it sounded good, and it played even better, bringing us a fast-paced hybrid of Double Dragon and Street Fighter, but in a mech. It's a game that went on to be quite the cult classic in Japan, receiving a number of ports throughout the years, and even saw an unreleased Sega Mega Drive version finally make it out into the world quite recently, back in 2020. So Mad Stalker here was led up by 2 designers, Masaki Yukio and Masatoshi Imaizumi, and not long into the future, Masaki Yukio would eventually leave Phil in Cafe to join a little developer called Treasure and lead up a project called Guardian Heroes, a game that Treasure themselves said was heavily inspired by the combat of Mad Stalker. As for Masatoshi Imaizumi, well, he would stay with Phil in Cafe and head up a project called Panzer Bandit, which, while clearly inspired by some aspects of Guardian Heroes, notably the whole plane switching thing, it's still more closely linked to the combat of Mad Stalker. In fact, Mad Stalker itself would see a PlayStation exclusive remake a few months before Panzer Bandit's release that utilizes the exact same engine. So, as you can see, it's all connected. So there you go, if somebody is ready to dismiss this game as a simple clone, just remember these devs all loved playing and creating video games and were pretty much constantly inspired by one another's work. So if anything, all these games existing around the same time is kind of just a blessing in and of itself, and also all of them are really good, so it's a win-win. Anyway, that's enough of that, so let's take a look at Panzer Bandit, a game where you can juggle enemies into the sky until they die. You'll love to see it. So at its core, Panzer Bandit follows the standard beat-em-up formula. There's a lot of enemies in your way, and you can use simple but satisfying combat to remove them. Although the big difference is that instead of being able to move freely around the stage like in most beat-em-ups of the era, instead the gameplay is locked to a 2D plane, which means the movement and combat instead feels a little bit more like a fighting game. You press up to jump, you can execute things like quarter circles to perform fireballs and other special moves. I guess you could liken it to titles Ninja Warriors, or I don't know, Beautiful Joe, I guess. The primary focus of this game is how fun it is to beat enemies up, and being tied to a single plane not only makes it much easier to hit said enemies, but you've also got more options to dunk on them too, and let me tell you, it is very fun to dunk on enemies in this game. We'll cover more of the combat in a moment, but for now, let's take a look at the game's structure. Panzer Bandit allows you to choose from 4 different player characters in either single player or 2-player co-op, and from there, you gotta move through 8 stages of robot-filled enemies until you reach the end. Something quite nice about the game is that you can choose the order in which you play the initial 4 stages, and since the game kind of promotes multiple playthroughs for unlockable content, That addition is always a welcome one to help keep things a little bit fresh. Of the 4 characters available, we of course have our blue-haired protag Kao, who has this weird helper robot following him around, although, to be honest, given how strong this guy is, I think the robot is mostly just there to look cool. There's the ninja Kasumi, who has cool ninja moves, and also a robot cat dog thing. I'm not quite sure what it is, but it does shoot energy balls at enemies, so it's pretty cool. We've also got the adorable Miyu, a small girl with a big mech that she doesn't quite know how to use. And finally there's Ein, a cool smoking robot with a bunch of guns. This guy is probably the most straightforward of the characters gameplay wise, which is to say if you like shooting people a lot, he is an absolute blast to play. Each character shares some basic moves. You've got a button for light and heavy attacks, as well as an AoE attack that hits in front and behind your character. There's also a bunch of special moves unique to each character that you can execute by inputting some simple fighting game commands. You've got dash attacks, quarter circles for fireballs, and then there's usually a dragon punch you can use by double tapping before hitting a button. You can also use most of these inputs in the air as well for things like dive kicks, and they're all very useful and very fun to perform. And good news, if you're not particularly great with fighting game inputs, you can simply tap L2 and a direction to execute these moves too, which we love to see. Also, for the more defensive players, you can block in this game too, which is done by simply standing still and not inputting anything at all. And last but not least, we have our character exclusive super abilities, which are used by pressing the circle button. Some characters have a few different attacks depending on your inputs while pressing circle, but the important thing to note is that these moves drain some of your heat gauge, which you can see next to your health bar in the top left. If this runs out, you can't use any special moves, but if it fills all the way up to max, you can use your ultra special move by pressing the R2 button, which is both great for damage and getting your combo meter up, which means loads of coins and loads of points, baby. And yeah, that's pretty much a breakdown of the game's combat. It's very easy to pick up and get into, but crucially, there's a lot of fun things to play around with if you like beating up bad guys with style, and this is where I think the big appeal in this game lies. It's really fun to beat dudes up, and since the timing for combos and juggles are quite generous, you can do some pretty insane stuff in this game, and it's never not fun. Ko in particular has to be one of the most enjoyable characters to play in any video game ever. His moveset is so simple yet very effective, and if you can master it, you can literally toy with enemies like they're nothing. It's not only incredibly satisfying, but it looks damn cool too. Honestly, the majority of this game's enemies won't even give you too much trouble. They kind of feel like they're mostly there to help you get used to the combat, and so you can play around with them for big combos, which naturally you're gonna want to perform if you want those juicy high scores. But once you make it into one of the game's boss fights, you really begin to see the full potential of the combat, because the bosses in this game also have moves similar to your own, and as such, it really makes these battles feel like a round in a fighting game. And the thing is, these fights aren't cheap like in some beat-em-ups either. You can absolutely demolish these guys if you're on point with your combos, but similarly, they can do the same to you. So if there's ever a time to bring your A game, it's during these fights. And yeah, that's pretty much it really. 8 levels of dunking on robots and a bunch of cool boss fights in between. I'd say it takes roughly 45 minutes to reach the end of a single playthrough, and to me that feels like a good length, because beat-em-ups often run the risk of dragging a little towards the end thanks to their often quite limited and repetitive gameplay. But in this case, I think 45 minutes of all killer no filler fills you up just enough to not feel fatigued by the end. Of course though, this is a game you're going to want to play through a few times, because beating the game once with all 4 of the playable characters unlocks not 1, not 2, but 8 additional playable characters. Basically, every single boss from the story mode is also playable in the story mode. And yes, while there are some clone characters, I love Shadow the Hedgehog Ko over here and his evil robot to boot, most of these guys have their own unique movesets and are a ton of fun to play in their own right. Now, what happens if you beat the story mode with these extra characters? Well, then you can unlock them for play in the game's versus mode, which is more or less just a fun fighting game mode that you can play with up to 4 friends. I imagine it's very chaotic, but hey, sometimes chaos is fun, you know? So as you can see, a pretty well-rounded and fun beat-em-up. As for the language barrier, well, it's mostly non-existent unless you plan on following the game's story, which there is a decent amount of, to be fair, although oddly none of your player characters ever seem to engage with the enemies and dialogue during this game, so I don't know, it seems rather skippable to me anyway, but to each their own. Now before we dig into this game's presentation and sound, you may notice that I'm yet to talk about the plane switching mechanic, which is the ability to jump in and out of the foreground by pressing the L1 or R1 button. The single feature that probably most closely links it to Guardian Heroes outside of the combat. Well, here's the thing, I found that I didn't really use it at all in this game. There's practically no attacks, mechanics, or gimmicks that require you to use it. Pretty much the only time I'd ever swap planes was if there was an item box on another plane, and oh yeah, items include health pickups, damage buffs, and a special meter refill, FYI. But for the most part, I found it just wasn't all that well implemented to the gameplay, at least in single player anyway. Personally, I think its inclusion is almost entirely to cater to multiplayer, because two people fighting on the same plane is rather chaotic, and the ability to occupy your own lane certainly makes things a little more coherent. Don't get me wrong, it is still rather chaotic like this, but a little less chaotic at least. And of course, if you're going to be playing versus mode with 4 people, well, the benefits go without saying. In fact, when you really break it down, despite a lot of overt similarities between Panzer Bandit and Guardian Heroes, they are in fact two pretty different experiences gameplay-wise. Guardian Heroes aims to be this hybrid of role-playing game and beat 'em up with a more involved story, character leveling, branching paths, and I think it's just overall a more fleshed out and experimental video game experience, while Panzer Bandit is a more straightforward traditional beat 'em up that just happens to give you a lot of the benefits seen in Guardian Heroes, but just in a more short-form arcade-style format. Although personally I think the combat in Panzer Bandit is a bit more fast-paced and fluid, and honestly a little bit sillier as well, but come on, it's got a robot that smokes, so it's on brand to be fair. As for the presentation, well, I think it's clear by now that Fill-In Cafe certainly knew a thing or two about making good-looking 2D video games, and when it came to the PlayStation, they absolutely knew how to get the most out of the console in spite of its known 2D limitations. We've got smooth 60 FPS gameplay with big expressive character sprites, tons of animations, and some excellent punchy combat effects. Now you are still going to see some of the memory limitations rear their head with the game's enemies, who are mostly variations of the same robot grunt copy and pasted throughout the game, as well as some basic levels too, which are really just straight lines with a static background image and some simple stage elements added to the foreground and background for flair, but they still do look good, and there's some decent variety and some pretty cool highlights throughout. So even with some clear compromises, I think they did a great job in giving us this fun anime style brawler. And of course, speaking of anime, the opening is pretty damn good too. I imagine seeing this thing on a disc for the first time back in the 90s was a treat in and of itself, and let me tell you, it is still a treat to discover today, so you'll love to see it. As for the sound, well, Panzer Bandit pretty much knocks it out of the park. The music is varied, catchy, and a joy throughout, but for me, it's the sound effects that really play a big role in enhancing the feel of the game's combat, because I think to make a really satisfying combat system in a game, you've got to achieve the trifecta. It's got to feel good, it's got to look good, and it's got to sound good, and this game manages to achieve all three. The way the game kind of pauses briefly on each hit in a combo along with a chunky sound effect accompanying each hit goes such a long way in making the combat as fun and satisfying as it is. Here, check it out a little and see for yourself. Anyway, that's a look at Panzer Bandit, a game that, despite its reputation as Guardian Heroes on the PlayStation, does enough different to make it stand on its own 2 feet. Plus, it also helps that it's really good. To me, this is a definition of a gamer's game. The type of game I think people who watch these videos will probably really enjoy. I mean, it's quite simple, it's rather short and oftentimes very chaotic, especially in multiplayer, but it's as video gamey a game as they come, and I think if you're the type of person who appreciates a simple video game experience that plays incredibly well, or you're somebody who likes labbing combos in weird old video games, well then this is one that you definitely shouldn't sleep on. Naturally, it's quite expensive to buy a physical copy online nowadays, and if I'm being honest, I actually expected this game to cost a little more than it does currently, but it did also get a Japanese PSN release back in 2011, so that probably helps keep the cost down a little bit too. But anyway, however you choose to play it, Panzer Bandit is a game well worth your time, and since a playthrough only takes about 45 minutes, well, it frees you up for the other things in life, like playing with your cats or drawing fan art of a buff smoking robot. You know, the important stuff.
You will provide.
Ninpuu Sentai! Hurricaneger!
シュシュッと参上シュシュッと忍者じゃん巻き起こせ勇気のハリケーンくじけそうになる気持ちを今笑顔に変えたら新しい日々をかけてゆくのさ前だけ見つめてこの星を守るために受け継いできた秘密の力三つの心を合わせたら信じた未来に頑張ろうシュシュッと参上シュシュッと忍者じゃん覚悟しろよ絶対シュシュッと参上シュシュッと強度燃え上がれ正義のハリケーン忍風戦隊ハリケーンじゃ風になれ Ninpuu Sentai Hurricaneger!
Rounding things out today, we have the final game of Volume 14, and that's Ninpuu Sentai Hurricaneger, which, unlike the rest of the games we've looked at today, made it to the PlayStation rather late in its life cycle, releasing in November 2002. This game was chosen for us today by Mr. Grandfex1097 and brings us a welcome return to the world of tokusatsu video games, and in this case we're taking a look at one of the most well-known tokusatsu series, Super Sentai, aka Power Rangers, over here in the West. Now, the original PlayStation has quite a large number of games based on tokusatsu series, and of course, most of them are Japan-only exclusives. You've got your heavy hitters like Ultraman, Kamen Rider, and of course all those kaiju games, which means I've once again got an opportunity to tell you to play Gamera 2000, so yeah, go play Gamera 2000. But when it comes to Super Sentai games, there's probably less releases on the platform than you'd expect, as there's a grand total of just 5 Super Sentai / Power Rangers games that ever made it to the PlayStation. First up, we have Power Rangers Zeo Pinball in 1996, which is a fun little level-based pinball game, and the only one to receive both a Japanese and Western release, and oddly enough, despite being developed in Japan, actually keeps the Power Rangers branding and has some pretty cool box art to boot. After that, we got a duo of Western exclusive Power Rangers games from UK developer Climax. There was Lightspeed Rescue in 2000, which was a very janky beat 'em up, and then we got Time Force in 2001, which is an even jankier beat 'em up, and it's also the only Power Rangers game I own. But hey, at least it comes in handy for bonus cat footage. And finally, we have a duo of Japan-only Super Sentai titles from Natsume, of all people. First up, there's 2001's Hyakuju Sentai Gao Ranger, aka Power Rangers Wild Force over in the West, and in 2002, we got the final Super Sentai game on the PlayStation, Ninpuu Sentai Hurricaneger, aka Power Rangers Ninja Storm over in the West, and also our selection for this episode. Now, the reason I bring up these other PlayStation games is partly to inform you of the history of Sentai and Power Rangers games on the console, because come on, who doesn't love a bit of Power Rangers pinball, you know? But also because today's game, Ninpuu Sentai, is a direct sequel to the 2001 Gao Ranger game, and if you look at both of these side by side, well, you can clearly tell they have a lot in common. So if you happen to enjoy what you see in today's game, just know Gao Ranger is a slightly less polished and less feature-rich version of this game, only with more animal poses and weird running animations. So now with that out of the way, here's Ninpuu Sentai Hurricaneger, a cool fighting beat-em-up big robot shooting game hybrid, and one big love letter to the silliness of this series. Oddly enough, this game has quite a lot in common with our last game, Panzer Bandit, which is to say, at its core, it's a beat-em-up that uses fighting game inputs and mechanics for its combat, and when you consider that this game was developed by Natsume, who have a history of making some rather fun Power Rangers games back on the Super Nintendo, the fighting game in particular being the basis for all those cool Natsume Gundam fighters that we've seen over the years, and well, things start sounding pretty promising right about now, so let's see how that all pans out. Now, first things first, when you boot up this game, you're going to get brought to this incredible hamster menu. Now, I don't know if you can tell, but I'm not very well versed in Power Rangers or Super Sentai stuff outside of the Mighty Morphing era, but yeah, whoever decided to have the ninjas be mentored by a talking hamster deserves a raise, cause seeing a hamster just running around while this great beat plays in the background, it's top tier stuff. Anyway, once you start the game, you've got a limited set of modes to choose from, but don't worry, these modes will grow quite a bit as the game goes on, so we'll just go through all of them one by one. First up, we have the main story mode, which you can play with either 1 or 2 players in co-op. The formula here is that you pick your favorite ranger, all of which featuring their own unique movesets and special moves, and then go to town on some fodder enemies before you eventually fight a boss. Now, these segments play out structurally like a beat 'em up, but the actual fighting arenas themselves feel very much like a fighting game, as they're quite small and don't really see you moving throughout the level. It's more so a case of just sticking to one area and then taking out any enemies who happen to appear on screen. Every now and then the screen might transition to a new area where you'll fight even more enemies or a boss, which isn't just a cool opportunity to see some funny ninja movement, but it also changes up the rangers in use too. And if you ended up picking the change option during the character select screen, it automatically picks you a new ranger to play as after these transitions. A nice little feature if you care to mix things up. Now, the combat itself is once again pretty damn good actually. It's kept quite simple with 2 attack buttons that can be easily linked into combos, and you've got a range of jumping and dash attacks, and of course the old tried and tested special moves tied to quarter circles and dragon punch inputs. There's unfortunately no moves list that I could find in-game or online, but if you mess around with some basic fighting game stuff, you should be able to pull off some pretty fun and stylish combos with ease, and once again that's mostly down to your character's movement being tied to a 2D plane, unless you're playing as the second ranger, in which case you can just wander around freely and cause havoc as you please. I mean, the second player doesn't even have a health bar, so it's basically like being Tails in Sonic 2, great for people who have no idea what's going on, but still like to contribute. Kinda. You might also have noticed this meter in the bottom right of the screen, and this is your ninja power meter. It fills up automatically during combat and lets you unleash a super move using the triangle button. Now, depending on the character you're using and the level this meter is at when you use it, you'll get a fun special animation which not only looks really cool, but does a ton of damage as well. Always a great way to end a combo in style. And for the most part, this is the main gameplay of this title. It's notably quite limited in scope, but the important part is that the combat itself is really fun and satisfying in action, simple enough to pick up and play for a beginner, but also with enough depth to reward players who are willing to play around with the character's movesets, and it manages to do this with a sense of flair and style that really plays into the appeal of the source material, which is more or less just watching people do cool fighting moves against lower tier grunts, and then watching ridiculous scenes of them getting blown up with the most insane weaponry imaginable. Now, of course, even though this is the main component of the game, there are some other fun sections that change up the gameplay quite a bit, including the shooting sections, where you gotta take out enemies with some shurikens while defending yourself from incoming projectiles using a little melee attack. Now, you only play 2 short segments of this during the story mode, but honestly I'd probably play a whole game in this style if it was fleshed out a bit more. I mean, who wouldn't want to play a Super Sentai rail shooter? Actually, that's probably a pretty small portion of people, so yeah, scratch that. But the bit that I know you've all been waiting for, it ain't a Super Sentai show without a giant robot. Well, at least that's been the case since Japanese Spider-Man got a giant robot and then everybody else needed one. I really can't believe this is the origin of the Megazord, but hey, here we are. That's right, once you beat the level's boss in a hand-to-hand fight, you've then got to close out the level by fighting a newly enlarged version of the boss using your cool transforming ninja Megazord. These sections are once again quite simple in terms of gameplay. They're basically broken up into 3 sections. One where you've got to dodge a number of projectile attacks from the boss, another where you got to tap a button repeatedly to stun them, and then finally you get a brief window where you get to wail on the enemy using a series of punches and weapon attacks. If you've ever played a Goemon game, it's actually quite similar to that. If you fail to beat the boss during this segment, you then return to step 1 and just repeat until it's over. Although, if you decide to use one of the Megazord's super moves during these scenes, the fights are sure to end quite quickly, and let me tell you, these attacks are pretty amazing. A lot of them happen to use footage from the show, and I cannot believe how ridiculous some of these things are. Seriously, if you're ever in a fight and somebody starts building a ramp in the sky, you get the fuck out of there. The Wheelie Man is coming for you. Now, similar to the main sections, these fights aren't all that difficult or complicated, but they are quite satisfying to play and seem to be primarily interested in giving you a fun cinematic robot fighting experience with high production values and cool clips from the show that manage to meld gameplay and live action scenes, and they do it very well. Like, you could definitely critique this game for its focus on style over substance, but if you compare this beat 'em up to, say, something like Time Force, which is probably a more gamey experience in the traditional sense, but I mean, look at the clear gulf in how good these games look in motion. This shit looks and feels like a Power Rangers or Super Sentai game, whereas this is a janky beat 'em up with Power Rangers branding. There's a level of care and attention to detail here that just screams, we made this game for the fans, and even though it's rather simple and basic in structure, its main goal is to pop fans of the show, and let me tell you, it does that with flying colors, especially since throughout the game, you're going to get to play as even more characters like the Crimson and Navy Thunder Rangers and the Green Samurai Ranger, complete with their own moves, and better yet, their own Megazords, which also politely fuse together to make even bigger Megazords. You absolutely love to see it. Frankly, it's a blast from start to finish, and despite a nice number of story segments and plenty of cool cutscenes throughout, the whole thing is very, very short, with only 6 levels, clocking in at about an hour's worth of runtime before you see the credits, and it is also very, very, very easy. Maybe there's a difficulty toggle somewhere, but the default difficulty as it is a cakewalk. A very fun cakewalk, but challenging, this game is not. Although, a nice perk of this game is that once you beat a mode, you almost always unlock something new in the process, and once you beat the story mode, you can then access a new special mission where you get to play as the Red Gare Ranger from the previous game. It's unfortunately just a one-off level, but the level itself and the boss are a significant jump in difficulty, which is quite nice to see. I even had to crack out the old Hadoken spam to make it past the boss in one piece, and it's nice to see that fighting game cheese is pretty much universal across all games. Also, this guy's running animation, it's just perfection. I mean, look at him go. So once you beat this big dude up with your big giant robot, you then unlock even more modes. This time, it's a bonus shooting mode where you gotta clear out all the enemies in a level as quickly as possible to get a high score. Now, unfortunately, once again, it's just a single level, but it is nice that there's at least some more shooting content to dig into, and if you can beat this shooting mode, you can then unlock survival mode, which is exactly what it says on the tin. Defeat as many opponents as you can before your life runs out, and if you're really crazy, you can even take on a one-hit death variant, of which I would absolutely not recommend playing while using this little thing. Oh yeah, you might have also noticed that I'm playing as a few new and interesting characters. Well, that's because this game also has a full fighting versus mode where you can play as any of the rangers or boss characters in 1v1 fights against a CPU or a friend, and there is quite a lot of these characters too, and if you've been beating all the modes that we've mentioned so far, you'll have pretty much unlocked them all. But wait, there are even more characters to unlock, and if you manage to beat over 50 enemies in survival mode, you can unlock one final additional mode, a one-player arcade mode for the fighting game, which we love to see. If you manage to beat this mode, that's how you unlock this weird alien thing called the Master, I think, and the last character, who I know you're all dying to see, you can unlock by beating 10 people in one-hit survival mode, and there he is, the greatest character in fighting game history. This, ladies and gentlemen, is what video games are all about. And yeah, that's pretty much the complete Ninpuu Sentai Hurricaneger package, and while it certainly has a lot more heft than its short story mode lets on, to play through and unlock everything that you've just seen here, well, it's still only going to take you about another hour to do, so once you've burned through the initial 2 hours, well, the only thing that's really going to keep people sticking around are the fighting modes, I'd imagine, and to its credit, it is a pretty fun and character-filled fighter, although one that's probably lacking a bit too much in the polish and balance department. A game that's certainly fun to mess around with, but not one that I think will be taking the fighting game community by storm anytime soon, although, let's be fair, they will play absolutely anything, so never say never. Like, I'm not going to pretend that I wouldn't pop hard at some clutch high-level hamster play, you know? Now, I suppose all that's really left to talk about is the game's presentation, and I mean, you've seen it in action quite a bit by now. The fights, the special moves, all the cutscenes. This is a very good-looking PlayStation game, albeit one that is ever so slightly letterboxed to help keep that frame rate smooth. You can tell most of the effort went into the character models above all else, and as a result, the backgrounds kind of take a backseat to the action on screen, but if the characters and actions look this good, well then it's something that's quite easy to forgive. But the thing that really sells me the Super Sentai experience in this game is the smooth melding of gameplay and live action scenes from the show, because this stuff is just so crazy and over the top, and a huge part of what makes these shows so much fun to watch, and to be able to have so many of these in-game, but also use them to enhance aspects of the gameplay, well, to me, that's great work all around. Yeah, sure, it is a little bit of the old style and place of substance, but it feels like a game that knows what its audience wants, and on the presentation front, I think it delivers in spades. Although of all the places I didn't expect this game to deliver, Ninpuu Sentai is also packing an absolute banger of a soundtrack. I mean, you've already heard the lovely hamster menu bop, and there's also the show's theme tune, which is probably going to get this video demonetized, but it's so good I don't even care. But literally everywhere else in this game, the battle stages, the big robot fights, even the mini-games, the music is constantly packing heat. I don't know if this is music that they use in the actual show, but either way, it's pretty damn great and a nice hidden gem of a soundtrack for you music lovers out there to enjoy. And that was a look at Ninpuu Sentai Hurricaneger on the PS1. It's very easy, it's very short, and it's maybe lacking a little in substance, and the menus being entirely in Japanese might take a little while to get used to, but my god, is it a fun ride. Even if you're not a Super Sentai fan, I think this game offers up a really enjoyable hybrid of fighter and beat 'em up that anybody can appreciate, and the cool cinematic giant robot fights, well, that's just the icing on the cake really, but at its heart, you can tell this is a game that was made for Super Sentai fans first and foremost. It's so easy to make a game like this with the express purpose of it being a quick cash grab to draw in fans of the show, but this game clearly respects its source material and the people who are gonna be buying it. And look, I don't think many people out there expect licensed games based off of movies or TV series to be amazing or anything, but when they are fun video games in their own right and they let you play around in a universe that you love, well then what more can you ask for really? So needless to say, if you're a Super Sentai fan, check out both this and its predecessor Hurricaneger as well, which as mentioned before is more of the same. So if you happen to be a Wild Force kid, well, go weird animal run your way to eBay to pick up a copy. As for everybody else, well, you might as well just try to vibe with the hamster at least, if he's not beating you to a pulp. And with that, I think it's about time we bring a close to Volume 14, which was one of the nicer episodes to put together because most of the games were really fun and also rather short, which is quite the blessing for stupid people who make long PS1 videos in their spare time. We got to check out a firefighting game where you fight dinosaurs for some reason, a trilling and trashing battle simulator where I always run out of ammo, a fast-paced 2D beat-em-up where bullying your enemies is a big part of the charm, and finally a cool licensed 3D beat-em-up that might get you put on a PETA watch list. A very nice selection for today, but the important question, where are they going to end up in the old arbitrary ranking system? Are any of these games must-plays, worth trying if you like the look of them, maybe just kinda meh, total trash, or did I find them unplayable due to the language barrier? Well, today's entry sees Metal Jacket making it into the meh tier, the Firemen 2 and Ninpuu Sentai making it into Tri tier, and finally we have Panzer Bandit giving the Japan-only series yet another must-play in its repertoire. You love to see it. Metal Jacket is clearly an early example of the mech combat genre, both in terms of visuals, design, and I guess, content. There is certainly something quite appealing nowadays to its low poly visuals, and there is also some nice audio design and heft when it comes to the mechs themselves, but unfortunately the lackluster combat and limited do-it-yourself structure just kinda makes it feel like a relic of the past, an interesting footnote in the mech genre, but one that I can't imagine many will get much out of nowadays, although at least that mech damage effect was pretty cool, so we'll always have that. As for the Firemen 2, Pete and Danny, well, it's one of those rare cases where a really enjoyable video game also somehow ends up being a big disappointment too. Like, don't get me wrong, you could play this thing for 45 minutes and have a blast, but as soon as you play the original Firemen and see what you've been missing out on, it just kind of feels like a missed opportunity and a waste of a crazy premise. Still though, if you're looking for a fun short game or something to play with a friend, it still comes highly recommended just for how fun and unique the concept is to this very day, and you know, someone's got to save those penguins, so get to work. Ninpuu Sentai Hurricaneger, on the other hand, a great example of a licensed video game. The gameplay as a whole, probably not gonna set the world on fire, but it's competent, flashy, easy to pick up and play, and it lets you fight as a hamster. I mean, what more could you want? If you're a Super Sentai or Power Rangers fan, absolutely check this game out ASAP. Everybody else, if you've got 2 hours to kill and like punching things with a giant robot, there are certainly worse ways that you could spend your time. You know, funnily enough, I even ended up watching a few episodes of the show after playing this game, both the Japanese and Western versions actually, which are really fun to watch close together and compare the differences between the two. For example, the hamster in the Sentai version is both a real hamster and a puppet when he needs to be, while the version in Power Rangers is CGI and is also now a guinea pig for some reason, which I guess is kind of weird, but he does have a cute little outfit, so, you know, good for him. And finally, we have Panzer Bandit, a game that, in many ways, is quite similar to our last game. Well, at least some of it anyway. But while Ninpuu Sentai represents a great example of a good licensed video game, Panzer Bandit is a fine example of the beat-em-up genre as a whole, managing to give us a game that's high on action and style, but also one that delivers a really fun and polished combat system that balances simplicity and depth to give us one of the most satisfying beat-em-ups of this generation. Sure, it's rather short and straightforward, I mean it is an arcade-style beat-em-up after all, but with a bunch of characters to unlock, a fun fighting game mode to play around in, and some lovely visuals and music, this is another Japan-only exclusive that you do not want to sleep on, so get right on it. Now before we finish up, we've of course got to give a big shout out to the wheels chosen for this episode, so give it up for Max and Red Fox for the Firemen 2, Peter Plopper for Metal Jacket, Siegmeme, the Seven Wags, and Dylan for Panzer Bandit, and finally Mr. Grandfex 1097 for Ninpuu Sentai Hurricaneger. Thanks a mil for your contribution, and I hope you all enjoyed the episode. I'd also like to give a special thanks to my fiancée Orla, who took time out of her busy schedule of playing Tears of the Kingdom and joined me for some co-op action in this episode. Now just in case you're wondering, she said her favourite game of the bunch was the Firemen 2, so I guess that's the first game to get the bonus Orla stamp of approval. Great job. Also, we gotta give a lovely shout out to the folks over on patreon.com for supporting the channel and helping to make videos like this possible, including fine folks like Alan Caslin, Bloody Cassie, Callow Mellow, Crimson Cyclist, Dave Nolan, Discun, the mascot for the Famicom Disk System, Doma, Globe99, James Leviathe, Kyle Winter, Moomin Biscuit, Trans Rights Are Human Rights, Mr. the Joshmon, Nathan McMullen, Richard Kramer, SN Kerstead, and Spectre117, who have all subscribed at the Fan++ tier. And finally, last but not least, a big thank you to you at home or wherever you are for watching this video. I'll be back real soon with some more PS1 content, but until then, take it easy, look after yourselves, and I'll talk to you again real soon. See ya!
シュシュッと参上シュシュッと忍者じゃん巻き起こせ勇気のハリケーンくじけそうになる気持ちを今笑顔に